Hi, I'm Zara Castellanos. For 18 months, I polished marble floors and dusted priceless antiques at Ravencrest Estate, believing I was invisible to Vincent Blackwood. I scrubbed his toilets, organized his wine cellar, and watched him host elaborate dinner parties from behind kitchen doors. What I didn't know was that every move I made, every conversation I overheard, every trust I built with his guests, it was all feeding into something much darker. The estate wasn't just his home, it was his hunting ground. And I wasn't his employee, I was his perfect, unsuspecting weapon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The day I discovered the truth, Vincent wasn't the one who looked surprised. Because while I thought I was earning an honest living, he'd been using my immigration status, my desperation, and my genuine kindness to orchestrate a con that would have destroyed lives and landed me in federal prison. But here's what Vincent Blackwood never counted on. I might have cleaned his floors, but I never learned to bow. The brass nameplate on the wrought-iron gates read Ravencrest Estate in elegant script, but it might as well have said Abandon Hope. Not because the place was sinister, quite the opposite. Rolling lawns stretched toward distant hills, manicured hedges created perfect geometric patterns, and the mansion itself rose like something from a fairy tale, all stone towers and climbing ivy. It was beautiful enough to make you forget that fairy tales usually involved someone getting eaten. I pressed the intercom button with a trembling finger, clutching the employment letter that had arrived 3 weeks earlier. Mrs. Delacroix's voice crackled through the speaker, crisp and efficient. "Miss Castellanos, I presume you're precisely on time. Drive up to the service entrance. The path curves around to the left." The gravel crunched under my ancient Honda's tires as I followed the winding driveway. Ravencrest Estate sprawled across what felt like half of Connecticut, with outbuildings scattered across the property like afterthoughts from a giant's toy box. The main house dominated everything, its Gothic windows catching the late afternoon sun and throwing golden reflections across the landscape. I parked beside a delivery truck and took a deep breath. 6 months earlier, I'd been working 3 jobs in Pueblo Nuevo, cleaning offices at night, waitressing during lunch shifts, and tutoring kids in math on weekends. The money barely covered my studio apartment, and the monthly payments I sent to my mother for my younger brother's medical bill. When the agency called about a live-in position at a private estate in Connecticut, offering twice what I was making combined, it felt like divine intervention. Miss Delacroix appeared at the service door before I could knock. A woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a perfect chignon, and the kind of posture that suggested she'd been born wearing pearls. She looked me up and down with the practiced eye of someone who'd hired dozens of domestic staff. "Welcome to Ravencrest," she said, stepping aside to let me enter. "I trust your journey wasn't too difficult. The master is particular about punctuality, but he appreciates dedication more than perfection." The service hallway was wider than my entire apartment back home, with cream-colored walls and gleaming hardwood floors that reflected the warm light from antique sconces. Mrs. Delacroix led me through a maze of corridors, past a commercial kitchen that could have serviced a restaurant, and into a sitting room where she gestured for me to take a seat on a velvet armchair. "Your references were impeccable," she began, settling across from me with a leather portfolio. "The Hendersons spoke very highly of your work ethic, and your college professors noted your attention to detail. Tell me, Miss Castellanos, what drew you to domestic service?" The question stung more than she probably intended. I'd graduated magna cum laude, with a degree in art history, spent 2 years applying for museum positions and gallery internships, only to discover that my resume looked great on paper, but lacked the connections that actually opened doors. When your father's a mechanic and your mother cleans houses, you don't exactly grow up knowing which fork to use at charity galas. "I enjoy creating beautiful spaces," I said carefully, "and I appreciate working somewhere with history and culture." Mrs. Delacroix nodded approvingly. "Ravencrest has been in the Blackwood family for 4 generations. The master, Vincent, inherited the estate from his grandfather and has spent considerable effort restoring it to its former glory. He's also expanded the art collection significantly. You'll find pieces from every major period, though I'm sure someone with your educational background will appreciate them more than most of our staff. She handed me a thick folder containing schedules, house rules, and what appeared to be a non-disclosure agreement, thicker than my college thesis. Your primary responsibilities will include maintaining the main house, assisting with entertaining when the master hosts guests, and ensuring that his private study and collection rooms remain pristine. The master values discretion above all else. You'll occasionally overhear business discussions, phone calls, and personal conversations. None of this information leaves the estate, ever. I signed the papers without reading them thoroughly, a mistake that would haunt me for months. At the time, I was too focused on the salary figure and the promise of my own small apartment in the estate's converted carriage house. Mrs. Delacroix explained that most of the staff lived off-site, but Vincent preferred having someone available for early morning meetings and late evening events. The master typically rises at 6 and expects his coffee and newspaper ready by 6:15, she continued. He works from his study most mornings, takes lunch at precisely noon, and often hosts dinner guests 2 or 3 evenings per week. Your schedule will vary depending on his social calendar, but you'll generally have Sunday afternoons and Monday mornings free. She led me through the main house, and I tried not to gawk like a tourist. The foyer featured a marble staircase that curved up toward a stained glass window depicting some medieval hunting scene. The dining room could have seated 20 people comfortably, with a chandelier that probably cost more than I'd ever earned. But it was the art that truly took my breath away. Original oil paintings that I recognized from textbooks, sculptures that belonged in the Metropolitan Museum, and tapestries that looked centuries old. The master's collection is quite extensive, Mrs. Delacroix noted, watching my reaction. He's particularly passionate about pieces with interesting provenance. Many of these items have fascinating histories. Some were rescued from estate sales, others discovered in European auctions. The master has quite an eye for finding treasures that others overlook. We paused in Vincent's study, a room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books and dominated by a massive mahogany desk. Paintings covered every available wall space, and I noticed several pieces that made my art history training tingle with recognition. A small Degas sketch hung near the window, and what looked suspiciously like a Picasso drawing was mounted behind the desk. You'll dust this room twice weekly, Mrs. Delacroix. The master is very particular about the arrangement of items on his desk, so please be careful not to disturb anything. He often works late into the night and leaves sensitive documents visible. That evening, I settled into my new quarters, a cozy apartment above the old carriage house, complete with a kitchenette, sitting area and bedroom with windows overlooking the estate's garden. It was the nicest place I'd ever lived, and for the first time in years, I felt like maybe things were finally looking up. My first meeting with Vincent Blackwood came the following morning. I was arranging fresh flowers in the dining room when he appeared in the doorway, and I nearly dropped the crystal vase I was holding. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with dark hair that was slightly too long to be businesslike, and the kind of sharp features that belonged on magazine covers. He wore an expensive suit with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to check price tag. "You must be Zara," he said, extending his hand with a smile that seemed genuine. "Welcome to Ravencrest. I hope Mrs. Delacroix didn't overwhelm you with too many rules yesterday." His handshake was firm but not aggressive, and his eyes, a startling shade of green, seemed to actually focus on me rather than looking through me the way wealthy people often did with service staff. There was something magnetic about his presence, a charisma that made you want to lean in closer when he spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I'm excited to be here. Please, call me Vincent. We're not terribly formal around here, despite what Mrs. Delacroix might suggest." He glanced at the flower arrangement I'd been working on, white lilies and baby's breath in a style I'd learned from watching YouTube tutorials. "Beautiful work. I noticed on your resume that you studied art history. Have you had a chance to look around the collection?" "A little, I admit. You have some incredible pieces. That Monet in the morning room is breathtaking." Vincent's smile widened. "Most people assume it's a reproduction." "You have a good eye." He paused, studying my face with an intensity that made me slightly uncomfortable. "I have a feeling you're going to fit in very well here, Zara. This house needs someone who appreciates beauty." Over the following weeks, I settled into the rhythm of life at Ravencrest. My days began before dawn, brewing Vincent's coffee and laying out his newspaper in the breakfast nook, overlooking the garden. He was unfailingly polite, always saying good morning and asking about my weekend plans, but maintaining the kind of professional distance you'd expect between employer and employee. The work itself wasn't difficult. The house was immaculate to begin with, and Vincent lived alone except for his sister Cordelia, who visited occasionally and treated me with the cool indifference of someone who'd never had to clean her own bathroom. Miss Delacroix managed the household with military precision, and the other staff members were friendly enough, though most of them had been working for the family for years and had their own established routine. What struck me most about Vincent was how different he seemed from other wealthy people I'd encountered. He never raised his voice, never left messes for me to clean up out of carelessness, and actually seemed interested in my opinions when he asked about them. When he discovered I spoke fluent Spanish, he asked me to help translate some documents related to a painting he was considering purchasing from a gallery in Madrid. The provenance is a bit murky, he explained, spreading photographs across his desk while I stood nearby with my feather duster. The seller claims it's been in his family since the 1940s, but something about his story doesn't quite add up. What does this letter say about the previous owner? I studied the handwritten Spanish text, translating slowly. It was a thank you note from someone named Eduardo Vasquez, expressing gratitude for help relocating his art collection during difficult times. The letter was dated 1943. It sounds like someone was helping him move his collection during the war, I said. Maybe hiding pieces from the Nazis. Vincent nodded thoughtfully. That's what I suspected. Unfortunately, a lot of art changed hands during that period under questionable circumstances. I try to be very careful about acquisition ethics. The last thing anyone wants is to accidentally purchase stolen art. It was conversations like these that made me believe Vincent was different from the stereotypical wealthy collector. He seemed genuinely concerned about doing the right thing, about preserving history rather than simply accumulating trophies. When he hosted dinner parties, elegant affairs where guests discussed art, literature and politics over 7-course meals, I found myself lingering in the hallway, listening to conversations that were more intellectually stimulating than anything I'd experienced since college. The guests were an eclectic mix: museum directors, university professors, art dealers and wealthy collectors from across New England. Vincent moved among them like a natural host, equally comfortable discussing Renaissance techniques and modern market trends. I began to understand why he'd inherited not just the estate, but also a reputation as one of the region's most knowledgeable private collectors. But it was during one of these dinner parties that I first noticed something that didn't quite fit. I was clearing dessert plates when I overheard Vincent talking to a woman I'd been introduced to as Dr. Sarah Chen, the director of acquisitions at a prestigious Boston museum. The derain came from a private collection in Switzerland, Vincent was saying. The family needed to liquidate quickly due to some financial difficulties. I was able to help them out while adding a remarkable piece to my collection. Dr. Chen nodded appreciatively. You always seem to find the most interesting opportunities, Vin. I don't suppose you'd consider loaning it for our upcoming exhibition on early 20th century color theory. I'd be delighted to discuss it, Vincent replied smoothly, though I should mention that the piece is currently being authenticated. You know how careful one has to be these days. Later that evening, as I was finishing the dishes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the conversation had been off. I'd been cleaning Vincent's study for 2 months, and I'd never seen a Derain painting. I knew his collection better than most people knew their own closets. Every piece had been dusted, every frame carefully cleaned. If he'd acquired something as significant as a Derain, wouldn't I have noticed? That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling of my carriage house apartment, trying to convince myself I was overthinking things. Vincent was a sophisticated collector who dealt with galleries and auction houses around the world. It was entirely possible he kept certain pieces in storage, or had them on loan elsewhere, or simply hadn't chosen to display them yet. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and over the following days, I found myself paying closer attention to Vincent's phone calls and business meetings. Most of the conversations were perfectly innocuous: discussions with insurance agents about coverage, calls to restoration experts about conservation work, negotiations with galleries about potential purchases. Then I overheard the call that changed everything. I was polishing silver in the pantry when Vincent's voice drifted through the slightly open door to his study. He was speaking in the low, careful tone he used for important business calls, and something about his inflection made me pause in my work. "The documentation looks perfect," he was saying. "Your contact in Prague did excellent work. The buyer will never question the provenance. The paper trail goes back to 1938, and the story about the family fleeing the Nazis is completely believable." My hands stilled on the silver serving tray. "Prague, documentation, paper trail," Vincent continued. "The Vasquez letter was a particularly nice touch. Spanish Civil War refugees make such sympathetic previous owners, don't they? People are always eager to help reunite families with their lost heritage." My blood turned to ice water. The Vasquez letter, the one I'd translated just weeks earlier, the one Vincent claimed had come with a painting he was considering purchasing, but now he was talking about it like something that had been created, not discovered. "Zara has been invaluable," Vincent's voice continued, and I nearly dropped the silver tray as I realized he was talking about me. Having someone with her background and language skills makes the whole operation so much more convincing. When she translates the documents, the buyers see an innocent graduate student, just doing her job. They never suspect that she's authenticating forgeries. The room spun around me. I gripped the edge of the pantry counter, fighting waves of nausea as the truth crashed over me like a cold wave. I wasn't Vincent's housekeeper. I was his unwitting accomplice in what sounded like an art forgery scheme. Everything I'd thought I knew about Vincent Blackwood, about Ravencrest Estate, about my new life, it was all a lie. I hadn't been hired for my cleaning skills or my education. I'd been recruited as a prop in an elaborate con game, and I'd been playing my part perfectly without even knowing I was on stage. The worst part wasn't the betrayal, it was the realization that every document I'd translated, every conversation I'd had with potential buyers, every time I'd vouched for a piece's authenticity by mentioning its interesting history, I'd been helping Vincent sell forged art to museums and private collectors. I was an accomplice to fraud, and I hadn't even known. As Vincent's voice continued through the door, discussing delivery schedules and payment arrangements, I realized that my fairy tale job had turned into a nightmare, and unlike Cinderella, I couldn't just lose a glass slipper and run away. I was trapped in Vincent Blackwood's web, and he held all the strings. The question was, what was I going to do about it? Sleep became impossible after that phone call. I spent the night pacing my small apartment, replaying every conversation I'd had with Vincent, every document I'd translated, every innocent smile I'd given to museum directors and collectors who'd visited the estate. Each memory felt contaminated now, like discovering that a favorite meal had been poisoned all along. By morning I'd convinced myself that maybe I'd misheard something, that Vincent's conversation could have had an innocent explanation. Maybe he was talking about reproductions for insurance purposes, or discussing a completely different matter that had nothing to do with the documents I'd worked on. Wealthy people had complicated business dealings that someone like me couldn't possibly understand. But when I arrived at the main house to prepare Vincent's coffee, Mrs. Delacroix was waiting for me in the kitchen with an expression that could have frozen champagne. She held a manila folder in her manicured hands, and gestured for me to sit at the small staff table near the service window. "Mr. Blackwood has asked me to discuss an expansion of your duties," she began, her voice carrying the same tone she might use to announce a funeral. "You've proven quite valuable in your current role, and he'd like to involve you more directly in his acquisition activity." The folder contained what appeared to be a crash course in art authentication and provenance research. There were photocopied pages from academic journals, guides to examining watermarks and paper aging, and detailed explanations of how to research the ownership history of artwork. At the bottom of the stack was a list of upcoming estate sales and private auctions across New England. "Mr. Blackwood would like you to accompany him to these events," Mrs. Delacroix continued. "Your academic background makes you an ideal candidate to assist with preliminary evaluation. You'll be expected to examine pieces, research their histories, and provide translations when necessary." My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. This wasn't an expansion of my housekeeping duties. This was Vincent drawing me deeper into whatever scheme he was running. Every instinct I had screamed at me to decline, to make some excuse about being uncomfortable with additional responsibilities. Instead, I heard myself saying, "Of course, I'd be happy to help." Mrs. Delacroix smiled with the warmth of a marble statue. "Excellent. Your first assignment is this afternoon. There's an estate sale in Westport, the Thornfield collection. Mr. Blackwood is particularly interested in some 19th-century European pieces that will be available for preview." The drive to Westport gave me too much time to think. Vincent piloted his silver Mercedes with the relaxed confidence of someone who'd never had to worry about traffic tickets or parking meters, making casual conversation about the changing leaves and the upcoming autumn social season. He seemed genuinely excited about the estate sale, pointing out landmarks along the way, and sharing stories about other collections he'd acquired pieces from over the years. The Thornfield family built their fortune in shipping during the 19th century, he explained as we wound through tree-lined streets toward an imposing Victorian mansion. Old Marcus Thornfield had exquisite taste but terrible business sense. The family's been selling off pieces for decades to maintain the estate, but they've finally decided to liquidate everything and move to Florida. The mansion was already crowded with potential buyers when we arrived, a mix of dealers, collectors, and curious locals drawn by the prospect of acquiring genuine antiques at estate sale price. Vincent moved through the crowd like he belonged there, greeting other collectors by name, and chatting knowledgeably about market trends and recent auction results. I followed him through rooms packed with furniture, paintings, and decorative objects, trying to look professional while fighting the growing certainty that I was being led deeper into something dangerous. Vincent would pause occasionally to examine a piece more closely, asking me to translate inscriptions or research marks that might indicate authenticity. "What do you think of that landscape over there?" he asked, nodding toward a painting that hung near the dining room's bay window. "The brushwork looks consistent with mid-19th century technique, but something about the signature bothers me." I studied the painting, a pastoral scene of rolling hills and grazing sheep, that could have been painted anywhere in Europe during the past 2 centuries. The signature in the lower right corner read, J. Moreau, but it was applied with different paint than the rest of the composition, as if it had been added later. "The signature does look suspicious, I admit. The paint appears fresher than the rest of the piece, and the brushstrokes don't match the artist's style in the main composition." Vincent nodded approvingly. "Exactly what I was thinking. Someone probably added a more valuable artist's name to increase the sale price." He made a note in his catalog, then moved on to examine a collection of small bronze sculptures. For a moment I felt a flutter of pride at having provided useful expertise. Then I remembered that Vincent might be planning to use my observations to create better forgeries, rather than avoid purchasing questionable pieces. The pattern continued throughout the afternoon. Vincent would ask my opinion about authenticity markers, provenance documentation, or historical context, and I would dutifully share my knowledge while wondering how it would be used against future victims. By the time we returned to Ravencrest, I felt like I'd spent the day teaching a master criminal how to perfect his craft. That evening I retreated to my apartment and called the one person I trusted completely, my Aunt Esperanza, who lived in a small town outside Albuquerque, and had raised me after my father died when I was 12. Esperanza had worked as a paralegal for 30 years before retiring, and she had an instinct for trouble that had kept our family out of countless disasters. "Misha," she said after I'd explained my situation in carefully vague terms, "you sound like you're describing a man who's very good at making people feel special while using them for his own purposes. These rich people, they don't hire girls like us because they need our help, they hire us because we make them look good to other people." Her words hit harder than I'd expected. "But Tia, he's been so kind to me. He treats me like my opinions matter, like I'm more than just the help. And that's exactly how he gets you to do what he wants without questioning it," Esperanza replied gently. "Baby, I've seen this before. Powerful men who charm people into compromising themselves, then act surprised when those people get hurt. You need to start paying attention to what he does, not what he says." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the manila folder Mrs. Delacroix had given me. Esperanza was right. I needed to start looking at Vincent's actions rather than his words, and his actions were telling a very different story than his charming conversations about art appreciation and cultural preservation. The next few weeks felt like living in a house of mirrors, where everything looked familiar but slightly distorted. I continued my regular housekeeping duties while accompanying Vincent to more estate sales, gallery openings, and private viewing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Each time, he would ask for my input on pieces he was considering, and each time I would provide expert analysis while wondering how it would be twisted to serve his purposes. I began keeping a notebook, recording the pieces Vincent showed interest in, the questions he asked, and the documents he had me translate. Patterns started to emerge that made my stomach clench with recognition. He was particularly interested in works with murky provenance, pieces that had changed hands during wartime, items from estate sales where the family history was incomplete, and paintings that showed signs of previous restoration or modification. More troubling were the phone calls I began overhearing with increasing frequency. Vincent's study was directly below my apartment, and sound carried through the old building's walls more than either of us had probably realized. Late-night conversations about documentation packages and client expectations painted a picture of an operation far more sophisticated than simple art dealing. "The museum director suspects nothing," I heard him say during one particularly chilling call. Zara's authentication gave the piece exactly the academic credibility we needed. Having someone with her credentials examine the documentation makes everything seem legitimate. I pressed my ear to the floor, straining to hear more of the conversation, but Vincent had moved away from the window. The fragments I caught were enough to confirm my worst fears. I wasn't just an unwitting accomplice in art forgery. I was being used as a weapon against the very institutions I'd dreamed of working for since college. The breaking point came during a dinner party Vincent hosted for several prominent museum directors and private collectors. I was serving the first course when I recognized one of the guests, Dr. Patricia Wells, the curator who'd rejected my internship application 2 years earlier. She was examining a small impressionist sketch that Vincent had recently acquired, praising its exceptional condition and clear provenance. "The documentation is remarkable," Dr. Wells was saying. "It's so rare to find pieces with such complete ownership records, especially from that period. Your authentication process must be quite thorough." Vincent smiled modestly. "I'm fortunate to have excellent help with research and documentation. My assistant Zara has an impressive background in art history. She's able to verify details that might escape less trained eyes." Dr. Wells glanced in my direction as I placed her soup bowl on the table. "Zara Castellanos, I remember your application. Your thesis on wartime art preservation was quite impressive, though we felt you needed more practical experience before joining our team." I managed to mumble a polite response, but inside I was screaming. Here was the woman who'd told me I wasn't qualified to work at her museum, praising Vincent's collection while I served dinner and provided unwitting authentication for what were probably elaborate forgeries. After the guests left, I helped Mrs. Delacroix clean up while Vincent retreated to his study for what had become his nightly phone calls. I was loading the dishwasher when I heard him speaking in the low, urgent tone that usually meant business rather than pleasure. "The Thornfield landscape worked perfectly," he was saying. "The buyer never questioned the new provenance documentation, and Zara's analysis of the brushwork technique sealed the deal. She's become quite valuable for lending academic credibility to the authentication process." My hands stilled on the dinner plates. The Thornfield landscape, the painting with the suspicious signature that I'd correctly identified as problematic. Somehow Vincent had taken my legitimate concerns about authenticity and used them to create a more convincing forgery. "The next shipment from Prague should arrive Tuesday," Vincent continued. "Make sure the gallery has the complete documentation package ready, and remind them that the family history needs to be consistent with the story Zara helped develop. Her translations have become part of the official record now." I set down the plate I was holding with shaking hands. Vincent wasn't just selling forged art. He was using my expertise to create convincing backstories for fake pieces, then pointing to my involvement as proof of their legitimacy. Every document I'd translated, every historical detail I'd provided, Every professional opinion I'd offered had been woven into an elaborate web of deception. Worse still, my name was apparently being used in the documentation. Museums and collectors weren't just buying Vincent's forgeries. They were buying them with my academic credentials attached as authentication. If the scheme ever unraveled, I wouldn't just be collateral damage. I'd be a primary suspect. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how I'd stumbled into such a nightmare. 6 months ago, I'd been struggling to make ends meet, but sleeping peacefully. Now I was living in luxury while participating in a criminal enterprise that could destroy my future and land me in federal prison. The irony was almost funny. I'd spent 2 years applying for museum positions, desperate to build a career in the art world. Now I was working in the art world after all. Just on the wrong side of the law. I thought about calling Aunt Esperanza again. But what could I tell her? That I'd discovered my dream job was actually a criminal conspiracy. That I was trapped in a mansion with a man who'd manipulated me into becoming his unwitting accomplice. That every day I stayed made me more complicit in whatever scheme he was running. Instead, I got up and walked to the window overlooking the estate ground. Ravencrest looked peaceful in the moonlight, its Gothic silhouette elegant against the star-filled sky. From this distance, it was easy to forget that the beautiful house was built on lies and filled with stolen art, but I couldn't forget. And more importantly, I couldn't pretend that staying here was still an option. Vincent had drawn me into his web so skillfully that I'd never seen the threads until they were already wrapped around me. Now I had to figure out how to escape without destroying myself in the process. The question was whether I was strong enough to walk away from the most comfortable life I'd ever known, especially when doing so might mean confessing to crimes I'd committed without realizing it, or whether I was brave enough to fight back against someone who'd proven he could manipulate me without my even knowing it was happening. As I stood at the window watching clouds drift across the moon, I realized that Vincent Blackwood had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that because I was desperate for stability and grateful for his attention, I would never question his motives or examine his methods too closely. He was wrong, and tomorrow, I was going to start proving it. Vincent's demeanor shifted subtly over the following days, like a photograph slowly coming into focus. What I'd initially interpreted as professional respect began to feel more like careful observation. He started asking more personal questions during our morning coffee routine about my family back home, my financial situation, my long-term career goals. At first I was flattered by his apparent interest in my life beyond housekeeping duty. "You mentioned your brother needs medical treatment," he said one morning, as I arranged fresh orchids in his study. "That must be financially challenging for your family." I paused in my flower arranging, unsure how much personal information was appropriate to share with my employee. "It's manageable," I replied carefully. "My mother and I take turns covering the costs." Vincent nodded sympathetically, then returned to his newspaper as if the conversation had been purely casual. But that afternoon, Miss Delacroix informed me that Vincent had approved a significant bonus for my exceptional work on the authentication projects. The amount was enough to cover my brother's treatment for the next 6 months. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental, but I was too grateful to question it deeply. That evening, I called my mother to share the good news, and for the first time in months, I heard genuine relief in her voice when she realized we wouldn't have to choose between Marco's medication and keeping the electricity on. "This Vincent, he sounds like a good man," my mother said. "Not many employers care about their workers' families like this," I agreed, pushing down the small voice in my head that whispered about manipulation and control. Vincent was helping my family during a crisis. Surely that indicated genuine kindness rather than calculated strategy. But the gifts kept coming. A week later, Vincent mentioned casually that he'd noticed my car making concerning noises in the driveway. By that afternoon, a local mechanic had arrived to perform extensive repairs, with instructions to bill Vincent directly. When I protested that I couldn't accept such an expensive gift, Vincent waved away my concerns. "Consider it a business expense," he said with that charming smile. "I need you to be reliable for our upcoming travel schedule, and I can't have you stranded on the highway between estate sales." The travel schedule he mentioned turned out to be extensive. Over the next month, we visited private collections from Boston to Philadelphia, with Vincent introducing me to dealers, collectors and museum professionals as his research associate. The title felt simultaneously flattering and fraudulent. I was gaining access to circles I'd dreamed of joining since college, but under circumstances that made every conversation feel like a performance. At each location, Vincent would seek my input on pieces he was considering, always in front of other people who could overhear my academic credentials and professional opinion. I began to notice that he particularly valued my assessments when potential sellers were present, as if my involvement lent additional credibility to his purchasing decision. Zara has an excellent eye for authenticity markers, he would tell sellers, often while I was examining a piece they claimed had been in their family for generations. Her graduate work focused on provenance research during wartime periods. She's saved me from several expensive mistakes. These introductions made me simultaneously proud and uncomfortable. I was being acknowledged for my expertise in spaces where I'd previously been invisible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Vincent was using my credentials as a shield for activities I didn't fully understand. The uncomfortable feeling became impossible to ignore during a visit to a private gallery in Providence, where Vincent was examining a small oil painting allegedly created by a minor impressionist artist. The gallery owner, a nervous man named Mr. Hartwell, kept glancing between Vincent and me as if he wasn't sure which of us was the actual buyer. "The documentation is quite complete," Mr. Hartwell was saying, producing a folder thick with papers. "The family brought it from France in the 1940s, and it's been in their possession ever since. There's even a letter from the artist's nephew confirming the attribution." Vincent asked me to examine the documentation while he studied the painting itself. The papers looked impressive, aged properly with watermarks that seemed consistent with the claimed time period. But as I read through the correspondence, something about the language felt wrong. The French was grammatically correct but oddly formal, like it had been translated from another language rather than written by a native speaker. "The letter is interesting," I said carefully, looking up from the documents, "but some of the phrasing seems unusual for informal family correspondence." Mr. Hartwell's face flushed slightly. "Well, you know how people wrote more formally in those days, especially when discussing valuable artwork." Vincent nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense, but I caught him exchanging a meaningful look with Mr. Hartwell that made my stomach clench. Later, as we drove back to Ravencrest, Vincent praised my observation about the language pattern. "You're absolutely right about the letter," he said. "The French was clearly written by someone whose first language was German or Dutch, probably a forger working in the 1970s, who didn't quite master the nuances of informal French correspondence." I felt a moment of satisfaction at having correctly identified the problem, followed immediately by confusion about why Vincent had purchased the painting anyway. When I asked about this, he gave me a smile that didn't quite reach his eye. "Sometimes it's useful to own documented fakes," he said cryptically. "They can teach you a lot about what to avoid in the future." That night, I lay awake trying to parse the meaning behind Vincent's comment. Why would someone deliberately purchase forged artwork? What could you learn from documented fakes that you couldn't learn from studying authentic pieces? And why did I get the feeling that Vincent's explanation was only a small part of the truth? My questions were answered the following week, when Cordelia Blackwood arrived for one of her periodic visits to the estate. Vincent's sister was everything I'd expected from meeting her briefly during my early days at Ravencrest: elegant, sharp-tongued and possessed of the casual cruelty that seemed to come naturally to people who'd never had to worry about money. She swept into the house like she owned it, which technically she partially did, trailing expensive luggage and complaints about the traffic from New York. Vincent greeted her with genuine warmth, and I retreated to the kitchen to prepare tea and arrange the imported pastries Miss Delacroix had ordered specially for Cordelia's visit. I was bringing the tea service to the morning room when I overheard their conversation taking an interesting turn. They were discussing what sounded like business matters, speaking in the kind of casual shorthand that family members use when they've been collaborating for years. The Providence piece worked perfectly, Cordelia was. Having Zara identify the documentation flaws, gave us exactly the leverage we needed to negotiate the price down. Hartwell practically paid us to take it off his hands once she pointed out the forgery markers. Vincent chuckled. She's been invaluable for that kind of thing. Sellers trust her academic credentials completely, so when she identifies problems, they assume she's protecting us from making expensive mistakes, rather than helping us acquire pieces for specific purposes. I stood frozen in the hallway, the tea tray trembling in my hands as the conversation continued. They were discussing me like I was a useful tool rather than a person, and more importantly, they were talking about using my expertise to manipulate sellers into reducing their prices. "How much longer do you think we can keep her in the dark?" Cordelia asked. "She's smart. Eventually she's going to start putting the pieces together." "Longer than you might think," Vincent replied confidently. "She's so grateful for the job security and the money for her family that she's willing to overlook inconsistencies. And frankly, she's in too deep now to walk away cleanly, even if she wanted to." Cordelia's laugh was sharp and cold. "You always did know how to pick them. Desperate enough to be grateful, smart enough to be useful, but naive enough to be controlled. Just like that curator you used in Boston last year." My hands were shaking so badly that I had to set the tea tray on the hall table before I dropped it. Vincent hadn't just manipulated me. Apparently, I was part of a pattern. There had been other women, other experts who'd been drawn into his schemes, through a combination of financial pressure and professional flattery. "The beauty of it," Vincent continued, "is that they never see themselves as participants. They think they're just doing their jobs, providing honest expertise. By the time they realize what's really happening, they're so complicit that exposing us would destroy their own career." I backed away from the morning room door, my mind reeling from what I'd heard. Vincent hadn't just been using my expertise. He'd been systematically trapping me in a web of complicity that would make it impossible for me to report his activities without implicating myself. Every piece I'd authenticated, every document I'd translated, every opinion I'd provided about market value or historical significance, had been carefully documented and filed away. If Vincent's operation ever came under investigation, I wouldn't just be a witness. I'd be a co-conspirator with my fingerprints on dozens of fraudulent transactions. I retreated to my apartment, claiming a sudden headache when Mrs. Delacroix asked about the delayed tea service. Once alone, I pulled out the notebook where I'd been recording my observations about Vincent's activities, and began connecting dots that painted an increasingly frightening picture. The estate sales, the gallery visits, the private collectors. Vincent had been using me to build a comprehensive database of authentication techniques, market values, and seller vulnerability. Every time I'd identified a fake or questioned a piece's provenance, I'd been providing him with information he could use to create better forgeries or manipulate future transactions. Worse still, my involvement had been carefully escalated over time. I'd started by simply translating documents, then progressed to providing authentication opinions, and finally to making public assessments that other professionals could reference. Vincent had been building my profile in the art world, while simultaneously compromising my professional integrity. The phone calls I'd overheard suddenly made more sense. When Vincent talked about documentation packages and client expectations, he wasn't just selling forged artwork, he was selling the authentication process itself. Buyers weren't just purchasing paintings or sculptures, they were purchasing the confidence that came from having their acquisitions verified by someone with legitimate academic credentials. My phone buzzed with a text message from Vincent, feeling better. "Cordelia would love to meet you properly over dinner, 7 o'clock in the dining room." I stared at the message, knowing that declining would raise questions I wasn't prepared to answer. But the thought of sitting across from Vincent and Cordelia pretending ignorance while they discussed my usefulness as a manipulation tool made me feel physically sick. Instead, I forced myself to shower and dress appropriately for dinner with the Blackwood siblings. If I was going to extricate myself from this situation, I needed to understand exactly how deep the conspiracy went and how many other people might be involved. Dinner was an exercise in performance art. Cordelia played the role of charming socialite, asking about my background and expressing fascination with my academic work. Vincent played the gracious host, sharing amusing anecdotes from our recent travels and praising my contributions to his collection research. I played the role of grateful employee, smiling and nodding at appropriate moments, while internally cataloging every detail of their behavior. The way they exchanged glances when I mentioned specific pieces from recent acquisition, the careful way they steered conversation away from certain topics, the subtle probing questions about my family's financial situation, and my long-term career plans. "You know," Cordelia said over dessert, "Vincent tells me you're quite gifted at identifying authentication issues. Have you ever considered working in insurance evaluation? I have several contacts in that field who might be interested in someone with your skills." The suggestion felt like a trap disguised as an opportunity. Insurance evaluation would give me access to even more high-value artwork and greater credibility in the authentication field, but it would also make me more valuable to Vincent's operation, and more complicit in whatever schemes he was running. "That's very kind," I replied carefully, "but I'm quite happy with my current position." Vincent smiled approvingly. "I'm not ready to lose Zara anytime soon. She's become indispensable here at Ravencrest." The word indispensable sent a chill down my spine. In Vincent's world, being indispensable probably meant being too valuable to release, and too dangerous to ignore. After dinner, I helped Mrs. Delacroix with the cleanup, while the siblings retreated to Vincent's study for what they called family business discussion. I lingered in the dining room longer than necessary, hoping to overhear fragments of their conversation, but they'd learned to keep their voices low when discussing sensitive matters. Instead, I retreated to my apartment and began making a list of everything I knew about Vincent's operation. The fake documentation from Prague, the manipulated authentication processes, the systematic use of my expertise to legitimize questionable transactions, the pattern of recruiting desperate academics and compromising them through gradual escalation of complicity. The picture that emerged was both more sophisticated and more dangerous than I'd initially realized. Vincent wasn't just selling forged artwork, he was running a comprehensive fraud operation that exploited the trust and desperation of multiple victims simultaneously. As I wrote, I began to understand why Vincent had been so confident about keeping me under control. He'd isolated me geographically by moving me to Ravencrest. He'd made me financially dependent through the generous salary and family assistance. He'd compromised me professionally by involving me in transactions that would be difficult to explain to authorities. Most importantly, he'd made me complicit in ways that I was only beginning to understand. Every day I stayed at Ravencrest, every authentication I provided, every document I translated, made me more deeply involved in his criminal enterprise. The realization was terrifying, but it was also clarifying. Vincent had been playing a long game, slowly drawing me deeper into his web, while making it increasingly difficult for me to escape. But he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that my gratitude and desperation would outweigh my integrity indefinitely. He was wrong, and it was time to start proving it. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against, and how many other people might be trapped in similar situations. Vincent had mentioned other women, other experts who'd been used and discarded. If I was going to expose his operation, I needed to find them and convince them to come forward. The question was whether I could do that before Vincent realized I was no longer the naive, grateful employee he thought he'd hired. Looking out my window at the moonlit estate grounds, I realized that my fairy tale job had turned into something much darker. But unlike the helpless heroines in traditional stories, I wasn't waiting for someone else to rescue me. I was going to rescue myself, and hopefully everyone else. Vincent had manipulated along the way. The first step in fighting back was learning to become invisible in plain sight. For 3 days after Cordelia's visit, I maintained my routine with mechanical precision, brewing Vincent's coffee at exactly 6:15, dusting his collection with the same careful attention, smiling politely when he made conversation about upcoming acquisition. But underneath the performance, I was gathering intelligence, with the focus of a detective working a case that could save her life. I started by mapping Vincent's schedule with obsessive detail. He made phone calls to Prague every Tuesday at 3 p.m., always from his private office with the door locked. Thursday mornings were reserved for what he called documentation review, which involved examining papers that arrived via overnight courier in packages with no return address.
Weekend evenings brought visitors who never stayed long but always left with small wrapped packages that looked suspiciously like artwork. Mrs. Delacroix proved to be an unexpected source of information, though she had no idea she was providing it. During our daily coordination meetings, she would mention Vincent's appointments, travel plans, and the various service providers who worked with the estate. I learned about the private restoration studio in Hartford that Vincent used for conservation work, the specialty shipping company that handled his international acquisitions, and the discreet storage facility where he kept pieces that weren't displayed in the main house. Miss Blackwood values privacy above all else, Mrs. Delacroix explained when I asked about the storage arrangements. Some collectors prefer to keep their most valuable pieces away from the main residence, for security reasons. He has quite an extensive collection that the public never sees. The comment sent ice through my veins. If Vincent had an entire hidden collection, how many fraudulent pieces might be involved? How many victims might there be, beyond the ones I'd witnessed? My breakthrough came during what should have been a routine trip to Hartford for Vincent's monthly meeting with his insurance broker. He'd asked me to accompany him to examine some pieces that were being considered for updated coverage, and I'd agreed with the enthusiasm of someone who still believed she was helping with legitimate business. The insurance office was located in a converted warehouse district, surrounded by art galleries and antique shops, that gave the area an appropriately creative atmosphere. Vincent introduced me to his broker, a thin man, named Caldwell, who seemed nervous in a way that went beyond normal professional anxiety. Miss Castellanos will be examining the documentation for the European pieces, Vincent explained, as Mr. Caldwell led us through a series of climate-controlled storage rooms. Her expertise in provenance research has been invaluable for ensuring our coverage is appropriate. The storage facility was impressive, dozens of paintings and sculptures arranged with museum-quality care, each piece meticulously labeled and photographed for insurance purposes. But as I began examining the documentation Mr. Caldwell provided, patterns emerged that made my academic training scream warning. Too many pieces had similar provenance stories: families fleeing wartime Europe, artwork saved from Nazi confiscation, grateful sellers liquidating collections to help relatives in financial distress. The documentation was professional and convincing, but the stories themselves were remarkably consistent in their emotional appeal and historical timing. More troubling were the authentication certificates.
Several pieces had been verified by experts I'd never heard of, despite my extensive graduate study in the field. When I discreetly photographed one certificate with my phone and later researched the supposed authenticator, I discovered that Dr. Vasquez of the Madrid Institute for Art Historical Research didn't exist. The institute was real, but no one by that name had ever worked there. The Monet study is particularly interesting, Mr. Caldwell was saying, gesturing toward a small painting that looked suspiciously similar to pieces I'd seen in Vincent's study. The family documentation traces its ownership back to the 1920s, with a clear chain of custody through several prominent European collections. I examined the painting carefully, noting the brushwork and color palette that seemed consistent with Monet's style but somehow lacked the spontaneous energy that characterized his authentic work. The signature looked correct, but signatures were often the easiest element for skilled forgers to replicate. The provenance documentation mentions a previous restoration, I observed, pointing to a line in the papers Mr. Caldwell had provided. Do you have records of what work was performed? Vincent stepped closer, his presence suddenly feeling oppressive in the small storage room. That's probably not necessary for insurance purposes, he said smoothly. The important thing is that the current condition is documented for coverage calculations. But Miss Caldwell was already producing another folder, seemingly eager to demonstrate the thoroughness of his record-keeping. Actually, we do have the restoration reports. The work was performed by a specialist in Prague, who focuses on Impressionist pieces. The restoration report was fascinating for all the wrong reasons. According to the documentation, extensive work had been performed on the painting's surface, including removal of later additions and reconstruction of damaged areas. In other words, someone had taken an existing painting and modified it significantly, exactly the kind of work that could transform a minor piece into something attributed to a major artist. This is remarkably comprehensive documentation, I said carefully, photographing the restoration report while pretending to admire its thoroughness. The Prague specialist certainly did extensive work. Vincent's hand suddenly appeared on my shoulder, his grip just firm enough to feel like a warning. Zara's academic background makes her appreciate detailed record-keeping, he told Mr. Caldwell. Though I think we've seen enough for insurance purposes. The drive back to Ravencrest was tense with unspoken undercurrents. Vincent made casual conversation about dinner plans and weekend guests, but I could feel him watching me in the car's mirrors, evaluating my reactions to what we'd seen in Hartford. The insurance documentation was quite impressive, I said, testing the waters. Mr. Caldwell certainly maintains thorough records. He's very professional, Vincent agreed. Insurance companies require extensive documentation these days, especially for high-value pieces. It's important to have everything properly verified and authenticated. The word authenticated hung in the air between us like a challenge. I was beginning to understand that Vincent's operation wasn't just about selling forged art. It was about creating entire fictional histories for pieces that had been systematically altered to increase their value and marketability. That evening, I locked myself in my apartment and began researching everything I'd seen in Hartford. The Prague restoration specialist turned out to be legitimate, but his work focused on a very specific type of modification, taking authentic but minor paintings and transforming them into works that could be attributed to more valuable artists. The insurance broker, Miss Caldwell, had an interesting history. He'd been investigated 3 years earlier for questionable appraisal practices, but never charged with any crimes. His current business specialized in insuring private collections with complex or unusual provenance situations. Most importantly, I discovered that several of the pieces I'd seen in storage had appeared at auction houses and private sales over the past 2 years, selling for amounts that would make Vincent's investment in forged documentation extremely profitable. The next morning brought a development that changed everything. I was arranging flowers in the foyer when the doorbell rang, unusual because most of Vincent's business associates used the private entrance near his study. Miss Delacroix answered the door to find a woman in her 30s with short dark hair and the kind of intense expression that suggested she was there for important business. "I'm looking for Vincent Blackwood," the woman said, showing Mrs. Delacroix what appeared to be an official identification card. "I'm Kai Nakamura from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Art Crime Team. We'd like to ask Mr. Blackwood some questions about recent acquisitions from European sources." Delacroix maintained her composure admirably, but I could see her hands trembling slightly as she asked Agent Nakamura to wait in the morning room while she located Vincent. I retreated to the kitchen, ostensibly to prepare tea but actually to process the implications of federal investigators appearing at Ravencrest. Vincent's reaction to the news was masterfully controlled. He emerged from his study dressed impeccably and wearing the kind of confident smile that suggested he'd been expecting this visit for some time. "Agent Nakamura," he said, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "How can I assist the Bureau today?" I positioned myself near the service door where I could overhear their conversation while remaining invisible to both parties. Agent Nakamura's questions were carefully neutral, focusing on Vincent's acquisition practices and his relationships with European dealers and auction houses. "We're investigating irregularities in the international art market," she explained. "Several pieces with questionable provenance have surfaced in recent sales, and your name has appeared in connection with some of the documentation involved." Vincent's response was smooth and entirely reasonable. He acknowledged working with various European sources, but emphasized his commitment to ethical acquisition practices and proper documentation. He mentioned his research associate, who specialized in provenance verification, describing me as a valuable asset in ensuring the legitimacy of his purchases. "Miss Castellanos has been instrumental in identifying problematic pieces," Vincent said, and I could hear the calculated praise in his voice. "Her academic background and language skills have saved me from several expensive mistakes involving questionable documentation." Agent Nakamura asked to speak with me, and Vincent readily agreed, presenting my involvement as evidence of his transparency and commitment to legitimate practices. Delacroix came to fetch me. I realized that Vincent was using my presence as a shield, proof that his operation was too open and professional to be involved in anything criminal. The interview with Agent Nakamura was both terrifying and enlightening. She asked detailed questions about my role at Ravencrest, the types of authentication work I'd performed, and my observations about Vincent's acquisition practices. Her questions were carefully worded to avoid leading me toward any particular conclusions, but I could sense that she was evaluating my level of knowledge and potential complicity. "Mr. Blackwood speaks very highly of your expertise," she said near the end of our conversation. "Have you ever had concerns about the authenticity or provenance of pieces you've examined?" The question felt like a crossroad. I could maintain my cover as an innocent employee, or I could provide information that might help the investigation, but would definitely expose my own involvement in Vincent's schemes. "I've identified several pieces with documentation issues," I said carefully. "Miss Blackwood has always been grateful when I've pointed out potential problems." Agent Nakamura nodded and made notes in her portfolio. "And how does Mr. Blackwood typically respond when you identify these issues?" "He's very thorough about investigating any concerns," I replied, which was technically true even though Vincent's investigations served purposes I was only beginning to understand. After Agent Nakamura left, Vincent's demeanor shifted subtly. He praised my handling of the interview and suggested that we should be prepared for additional scrutiny in the coming weeks. "Federal investigations can be quite disruptive," he said as we stood in his study surrounded by artwork that I now suspected was largely fraudulent. "It's important that we maintain our normal routines and continue to operate with complete transparency." The word transparency coming from Vincent felt like a dark joke, but I nodded agreeably and asked if there was anything specific I should know about handling future inquiries. "Just continue doing exactly what you've been doing," Vincent said with that charming smile that no longer fooled me. "Your honest expertise and professional approach are our best defense against any misunderstanding." That evening, I sat in my apartment, staring at Agent Nakamura's business card, and trying to decide whether to make the call that would change everything. Contacting the FBI would mean admitting my involvement in Vincent's operation, and potentially facing criminal charges myself. But staying silent would mean continuing to participate in crimes that were clearly much larger than I'd initially realized. The decision was made for me when I discovered the photographs on Vincent's desk the next morning. I was dusting his study when I noticed a manila envelope that had been left open, revealing glossy prints of various artwork. As I moved to close the envelope properly, I recognized several pieces from our recent travels. Paintings and sculptures that Vincent had purchased based on my authentication advice, but these weren't photographs of the pieces as I remembered them. These were before and after shots, showing the same artworks in different states. A minor landscape painting that I'd examined in Westport appeared in one photo looking exactly as I remembered it. Then in another photo with an additional signature and modified brushwork that transformed it into a piece attributed to a well-known American impressionist. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Vincent hadn't just been using my expertise to authenticate questionable pieces, he'd been using my analysis to improve forgeries that were then sold as authentic work. Every time I'd identified problems with documentation or attribution, I'd been providing a blueprint for creating more convincing fakes. I photographed the evidence with shaking hands, then carefully returned everything to its original position. But as I straightened up from Vincent's desk, I found him standing in the doorway watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Find something interesting, Zara?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone that made my blood freeze. For a moment, we stared at each other across his study, me with my feather duster in hand like a ridiculous weapon, him blocking the only exit with the calm confidence of someone who'd been planning for this moment. "I was just cleaning," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Vincent stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "I think we need to have a conversation," he said, and suddenly my fairy tale job felt less like Cinderella and more like Bluebeard's castle. The only difference was that I wasn't planning to be the victim who never made it out alive. The silence in Vincent's study stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. He moved to his desk with deliberate calm, settling into his leather chair while I remained standing near the bookshelf, feather duster still clutched in my trembling hand like some absurd symbol of my supposed innocence. "Sit down, Zara," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. His voice carried the same pleasant tone he'd used to discuss art acquisitions and dinner menus, but underneath it was something harder that I'd never heard before. I remained standing. I should finish the cleaning schedule. Mrs. Delacroix expects me. Delacroix works for me, Vincent interrupted smoothly. Just as you do. Now sit. The command in his voice was unmistakable, but I'd spent too many sleepless nights planning for this moment to be intimidated now. Instead of sitting, I moved closer to his desk, noting how he positioned himself between me and the manila envelope containing the incriminating photographs. I know what you've been doing, I said quietly. Vincent's smile was genuinely amused. Do you? And what exactly do you think that is? You've been using me to authenticate forged artwork. Every piece I examined, every document I translated, every opinion I provided, you used all of it to create more convincing fake. That's quite an accusation, Vincent replied, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed posture of someone discussing the weather. Do you have any proof of these allegations? The challenge in his voice told me he was confident that I didn't have enough evidence to damage him seriously. He was probably right. The photographs on his desk would be easy to explain away as documentation for insurance purposes, and my word against his would carry little weight with investigators who knew I'd been living comfortably on his estate for months. But Vincent had underestimated what I'd learned during my weeks of careful observation and documentation. More importantly, he'd underestimated my willingness to sacrifice my own safety to stop him from hurting other people. Agent Nakamura seemed very interested in the Prague connection, I said, watching his face for any reaction, especially the restoration work being performed there. For the first time, Vincent's composure slipped slightly. His fingers drummed once against his desk before he caught himself and stilled them. Agent Nakamura is fishing, he said. Federal investigators always cast wide nets when they're working cases without solid evidence. They hope someone will panic and make mistakes. Like the mistake of keeping before and after photographs of altered artwork in your desk. Vincent's expression hardened. You've been going through my private papers. I've been cleaning your study twice a week for months, I replied. It's difficult to avoid seeing things that are left in plain sight. We stared at each other across the mahogany desk, and I could see Vincent recalculating our relationship in real time. I was no longer the grateful, naive employee he'd hired. I was a threat that needed to be managed. Let's assume, hypothetically, that you're correct about some irregularities in my business practices, he said carefully. What exactly do you think you can do about it? I can tell the truth about what I've seen and done here. Vincent laughed, but there was no warmth in the sound. And destroy your own future in the process? Zara, you've been authenticating questionable pieces for months. Your name is on documentation that's been used to sell artwork to museums and private collectors. If you expose this operation, you'll be confessing to federal crime. The threat was delivered with Vincent's characteristic charm, but the underlying message was clear. He'd constructed his scheme so carefully that anyone who tried to expose him would be implicating themselves as co-conspirators. But at least I'll be telling the truth instead of living a lie. The truth is expensive, Vincent replied. Your brother's medical bills alone will bankrupt your family if you lose this position. And what museum or gallery will hire someone who's been involved in an art fraud investigation? You'll be unemployable in the field you love. Each word hit like a physical blow because they were all true. Vincent had trapped me so completely that exposing him would destroy everything I'd worked for since college. My career, my family's financial stability, my future, all of it would disappear if I chose to fight back. But as I stood in his study surrounded by stolen and forged artwork, I realized that some things were more important than personal cost. Every piece Vincent sold under false pretenses damaged the integrity of the art world I loved. Every collector he deceived diminished the trust that made cultural preservation possible. You're right, I said, quietly. Telling the truth will probably destroy my career and hurt my family financially. Vincent's smile returned, confident that he'd won another round of manipulation. But I'm going to do it anyway. The smile vanished. Zara, I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, holding it where he could see the screen. I've been recording our conversation. Everything you just said about irregularities in your business practices, and my involvement in questionable authentication work. Vincent lunged toward me,
but I'd anticipated his reaction and stepped quickly toward the door. I've also photographed the documents in your desk and sent copies to a secure email account that Agent Nakamura can access. You're making a terrible mistake, Vincent said, his charming facade finally cracking completely. You have no idea how powerful the people I work with are. This operation involves more than just art fraud. There are money laundering connections, international trafficking networks, people who won't hesitate to eliminate threats. The admission told me everything I needed to know about the scope of Vincent's crime. This wasn't just about selling forged paintings to wealthy collectors, it was about using the art market to move illegal money and conceal criminal activity on an international scale. Then Agent Nakamura definitely needs to hear about it, I said, backing toward the study door. Vincent moved to block my path, and for a moment, I thought he might try to physically restrain me, but the sound of Mrs. Delacroix's voice in the hallway seemed to remind him that violence would only create more problems. If you leave this room and contact the FBI, you'll be destroying more lives than just your own, he said urgently. There are other people involved in this operation, people like you who were recruited without understanding what they were really doing. Exposing this will ruin innocent people. The manipulation was expertly delivered, designed to make me feel responsible for protecting other victims of Vincent's schemes, but I'd learned too much about his methods to be swayed by false guilt. Then, they deserve the chance to tell their own stories instead of being trapped in yours. I opened the study door and stepped into the hallway, Vincent following close behind with his public mask sliding back into place as we emerged into view of the household staff. Zara, he said with forced casualness, I hope you'll reconsider our discussion. I'd hate for you to make any hasty decisions that you might regret. Mrs. Delacroix looked between us with obvious concern. Is everything all right? Everything's fine, I said, meeting Vincent's eyes directly. I was just telling Miss Blackwood that I'll be taking some personal time to handle a family matter. Vincent's smile was sharp as a blade. Of course, take all the time you need, but we both knew that once I left Ravencrest, I wouldn't be coming back. I returned to my apartment and packed quickly, taking only essential belongings and the evidence I'd gathered over the past weeks. As I loaded my car, I could see Vincent watching from his study window, probably making phone calls to warn his associates that their operation had been compromised. The drive to the FBI field office in Hartford felt like the longest journey of my life. Every mile took me further from the comfortable life I'd built at Ravencrest, and closer to an uncertain future that might include criminal charges, financial ruin, and the destruction of everything I'd worked for. But it also took me closer to the truth, and toward the possibility of stopping Vincent from manipulating other desperate young professionals who just wanted a chance to work in the field they love. Agent Nakamura listened to my story with professional calm, taking detailed notes and asking clarifying questions that demonstrated she'd already suspected much of what I was telling her. The recordings from my phone and the photographs I'd taken provided crucial evidence, but she warned me that building a case strong enough to prosecute would take time and require extensive cooperation from other victims. Mr. Blackwood has been on our radar for 2 years, she explained, but he's extremely careful about insulating himself from direct involvement in illegal activities. Having someone with inside knowledge willing to testify will make all the difference. The investigation that followed consumed the next 8 months of my life. I testified before federal grand juries, provided detailed depositions about every piece I'd examined at Ravencrest, and helped agents understand the sophisticated methods Vincent used to create convincing documentation for forged artwork. Most importantly, I connected with other victims of Vincent's operation, young academics and struggling professionals who'd been recruited through the same combination of financial pressure and professional flattery that had trapped me. Together we built a comprehensive picture of a criminal enterprise that had defrauded museums, collectors and insurance companies out of millions of dollars. The trial made national news, partly because of the amount of money involved and partly because of the sophisticated nature of the fraud scheme. Vincent's lawyers tried to portray him as a legitimate collector who'd been deceived by European forgers, but the evidence was overwhelming. When the verdict was announced, guilty on 12 counts including conspiracy, fraud and money laundering, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness and hope. Justice had been served, but it had come at enormous personal cost for everyone involved. My own legal situation was resolved through a cooperation agreement, that acknowledged my unwitting participation while recognizing my crucial role in exposing the crime. I avoided criminal charges but faced the professional consequences. Vincent had threatened. No reputable institution would hire someone who'd been involved in an art fraud case, even as a victim and whistleblower. But 6 months after the trial ended, I received an unexpected phone call that changed everything. Dr. Patricia Wells, the museum curator who'd rejected my internship application years earlier, had been following the case and wanted to meet. "What you did took extraordinary courage," she said over coffee in Hartford's Arts District. "Exposing that operation probably saved dozens of institutions from being defrauded, and the precedent will help prevent similar schemes in the future." She offered me a position with her museum's new authentication verification program, a department created specifically to help other institutions identify and avoid art fraud. It wasn't the career I'd originally planned, but it was meaningful work that used my experience in ways that could protect the art world I loved. "We need someone who understands how these schemes work from the inside," Dr. Wells explained. "Your expertise could help train a new generation of professionals to recognize and resist the kind of manipulation you experience." I accepted the position, and today I spend my time helping museums, galleries, and private collectors identify fraudulent artwork and questionable authentication practice. It's satisfying work that feels like a form of redemption, using the knowledge I gained through Vincent's manipulation to protect others from similar exploitation. The carriage house apartment at Ravencrest has been replaced by a modest condo near the museum, and the generous salary Vincent paid me has been replaced by a more typical academic wage. But I sleep peacefully now, knowing that my work serves institutions and individuals who share my genuine love for art and cultural preservation. Sometimes former colleagues ask if I regret my decision to expose Vincent's operation, given the personal cost involved. The answer is always no. Living a comfortable lie is still living a lie, and the temporary security I'd found at Ravencrest was built on a foundation that would have eventually collapsed anyway. More importantly, I learned that my value as a person isn't determined by how useful I am to powerful people who want to exploit my skills and desperation. Real security comes from living authentically and using your abilities in service of something larger than your own comfort. Vincent Blackwood taught me many things during my time at Ravencrest, though none of them were lessons he intended to share. He taught me to recognize the difference between kindness and manipulation. He taught me that financial dependence can become a form of imprisonment. Most importantly, he taught me that sometimes the only way to escape a trap is to accept the cost of breaking free. The estate still stands in the Connecticut Hills, now owned by the federal government and scheduled to become part of a state park system. The artwork that filled its rooms has been scattered, authentic pieces returned to their rightful owners, forgeries destroyed, and questionable items held as evidence until various legal proceedings conclude. But the most important thing that happened at Ravencrest was my own transformation from someone who sought validation from powerful people to someone who found strength in standing up for what was right regardless of the personal cost. And that transformation is something no one can ever take away from me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.